welcome. And what I will be doing is starting off our lecture. And what I want to do is basically give you a lesson. Why does the war in Ukraine matter to you? How does it apply to you? And for my students in public health, what does the war in Ukraine have to do with the future of public health? You might wonder what's the connection? What I'll tell you. For my last class, okay, so what are we going to look at? From gray zones to Georgia, from the Matrix to mercenaries, from destroyed dams to drones to drugs to dogs. Okay, and how will I make that all come together? This is about the transnational flows that are activated and surround this conflict. Okay, now for my public health class, remember what happened in 1492. And what does this have to do with the war in Ukraine? I'll tell you. When the Spaniards came to the New World, they killed 90% of the Native American population. When that happened, you had 90% of the population that was no longer chopping down forests. That had such a great effect on the environment. The forests that survived soaked in a lot of carbon, and it initiated a mini ice age. So many people died, it changed the Earth's ecology. The world became a lot colder after 1492, so much so that the demand for beaver furs skyrocketed. And the demand for beaver furs explained how the French and English came to North America, but also the story of how a duchy known as the Muscovy expanded. You see, and this is a very good video I recommend you watch on your own called Russia's Geography Problem. Let's look at the story of Russian expansion. Look at what this map is saying. Why are they going towards the Pacific? It's for the search of forests. Okay. What I'm going to tell you is the story of two rivers, the Yenisei and the Volga and the Dnipro. Okay. What do they all have? Beavers. Beavers to be hunted to survive the mini ice age. Okay. The search for beavers explains a Russian expansion into Siberia, Russian colonialism and imperialism, all the way to the Pacific, reaching the Alaska, where you had Russian fur traders meeting up with the French fur traders in Canada. And also another drive towards. Actually, this is an old school map I thought you would like. Russia and Asia. So now and these are all the classes I teach. Don't worry about that. It's from a notebook. Russia and Asia. What's the story of Russia and Asia? I'm giving you to it. The mini ice age drove Russian expansion into Siberia, and the same phenomena happened. A good part of the Siberian population had never been exposed to European diseases, so that you had natives of Siberia and America dying off. And let's look at these places here called independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary. Okay, it's just a nice old school image. Okay, but this is the other process that began. Okay? The minute you reach the Pacific, okay, now where is your next drive? To the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea. And as we speak, let's not forget that, of course, there's a war here. But let's not also forget that on a choke point here, and a choke point here, there's a war going on as well. And so you see, here's the story of how we get to Russia reaching Ukraine. Now, that was just a quick overview. Here we are. Any Ukrainian will insist that their war began exactly 10 years ago in February 2014. And it began with this lively picture in a place called the Maydan, the Arabic word for square. How do we have an Arabic Turkish word for square? Well, the other history of Ukraine is this, okay? There was a long time Ottoman influence. In fact, the greatest leader in Egyptian history, his name was Baybars. He was taken as a slave soldier from Ukraine, okay, imported to Egypt and basically took over the state. The greatest sultan in Egyptian history was Ukrainian. The greatest ruler of the Ottoman Empire, her name was Ruxlana. She was the wife of somebody named Suleiman the Great. Solomon gets all the credit. It's Ruxlana that kept the empire together, okay? Just remember, there's just as much Ukrainian history in the Middle East, okay? And that's the story. Russia coming to Ukraine was part of that project. The minute it became a Pacific empire, its desire was then to be a naval empire at the same time. So bringing us to the events of 2014. So Russia basically wages what we can say a indirect war against Ukraine. Okay. Now, at this point, I like this map a lot more than maps that divide the Middle East from Europe and Europe from the Middle East, because so much is going on when you create a map like this and focus on a territory known as Southwest Asia. Let me just begin. What's going on in Ukraine? Where does it fit in the conflicts that we're facing today? Let's just begin from east to west. We tend to forget China, India, and Pakistan all are fighting over a territory here known as Kashmir. Why is that important to you? We tend to forget these are three nuclear powers that are always on a state of nuclear alert. Whenever Putin talks about the use of nuclear weapons, the world gets anxious. Okay. What we're not getting anxious about is really what's happening on literally the roof of the world in the Himalayas. Now, let's work my way. I could tell you another story of geopolitics that in the former Russian Empire slash post-Soviet sphere, there was two wars that had occurred between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And why are they important? I would argue this is the first drone war, that this was a rehearsal of the use of drones over Ukraine. Okay. That a lot of the Turkish drones, the Bayraktar, that made such a difference for the Ukrainian army, got their experience fighting for Azerbaijan against Armenia. Okay, so this is a geopolitical. Then we have, let's not forget Turkey, which is a member of NATO. Okay? And when you see how close Turkey's NATO slash NATO border is to Georgia, you understand the next part of the story. The invasion of Georgia that begins as 2014, actually, I would argue, began with Russia's invasion of Georgia in 1993, with the breakaway of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, okay? And then the August War of 2008. 5 years later, you have the events of 2014 and the takeover of Crimea. I would argue this is the slow butchering, piecemeal process of taking away lands that belonged to the former empire. Then we get to the war that's going on here, right? The war going in Gaza. What does that have to do with Ukraine? There's only so much the world could pay attention to. And on October 7, 2023, when the first rockets were fired, I realized the immediate victim of that conflict would be Ukraine itself. That there's only so much attention the world can pay to conflicts at the same time. They're going to pick this one over that one. Then what have I done? I put a couple of blue squares to refer to conflicts over water. The Aral Sea that you're seeing here, okay, and the destruction of a dam in Ukraine that I'm going to be talking about later, I would argue is connected. It's the weaponization of water. If you're basically taking the Aral Sea and using it for an unproductive cotton program, I argue it is just as deadly as deliberately flooding, okay, an area by destroying a dam last summer. I'll get to that. And finally, look when I put an entire square around the Black Sea. What was weaponized here? The world's grain supply. The world's grain supply coming out of a city called Odessa. There has to go how many, let's look at how many choke points are there. There's the one on the Sea of Azov. There's the choke point of Istanbul, the Dardanelles, sorry, the Bosphorus, the Dardanelles. And then you have to realize that wheat has to go through Suez and Yemen to feed Africa. Do you know how many opportunities there are for wheat to get disrupted on the way to feed the African continent? That's why I like this map better. Okay. It really shows, I swear. Sorry about that. Okay. So let's begin. A map like this shows a different perspective, right? And this is where I would argue, if you look at these two territories here that were part of Georgia, and then another territory here that's kind of was broken away from Moldova, what am I saying? That the war that begins in 2014, okay, with the forced annexation of Crimea, was part of a historical process. These territories were more or less taken in 1993. Okay. Now, I'm going to skip that. I want to go to this person, Alexander Dugin, a professor of Moscow State University. I just like quoting him because he looks like he's like Rasputin, just coming resurrected. But anyway, look at what he's saying here. Okay. And now let me show you the following article. It's 2008, right? It is 5 days before Fred Weir basically gives us all the components for a war that will eventually erupt. On 5 days in August, Russia is going to invade Georgia proper, make a blitz towards Tbilisi. And Fred Weir is aware that this is going to happen, right? Now, look at who he quotes right here. It's Alexander Dugin, or Rasputin from before. And what does Dugin say? We cannot allow Ukraine to enter NATO as a whole state. He was saying this back in 2008. Okay. In other words, the world was taken by surprise when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. It was taken surprise by 2022. But what am I trying to show you as a historian was that there was nothing hidden about a kind of nostalgia for the former empire. Okay, so let's keep on going. And again, if you look at this article here, the war is over. It lasted 5 days. And what is Tomas asking? Now that Russia has attacked Georgia, what is going to be the future of Ukraine? If the EU does not side with Georgia, Russia will move to reassert control over all its former satellites. Again, this is back in 2018. Or what this article is saying in the meme. Let's see if it works. Oh, sorry about that.
So what is ClickUp? ClickUp is an all-in-one productivity software where you can manage everything in any
Okay.
portion of how you must.
What do we have here? I'm not sure if you remember this viral video, right? That's the EU. Here's the flag of Ukraine.
What it means for the wider region. I think one of your children has just walked in. I mean, shifting sands in the region. Do you think relations with the North may change? I would be surprised if they do.
That's the flag of Georgia. And that's a Russian flag.
My apologies. Into the region. My apologies.
Okay.
North Korea, South Korea.
Anyway, what that what is being said in a meme in that article? Now, I want to get what unites our lecture. I talked about Russia moving eastwards for the fur, so that a group of people known as the Buryats, okay, are eventually going to be part of the Russian Empire. Now, let us look at what I argue. What is this video about? It's about what I would say is about Russian neo-colonialism. Those who became conquered and part of the empire now become the cannon fodder in the next round of conflict. So let us begin. And this goes to how digital flows become a primary source in this conflict. Let's watch the fall.
We decided to test the report's methodology by looking into the background of a fighter named Bato Dambayev, an ethnic Buryat from Siberia, whose unit on the Mongolian border was said to have been sent to fight in Debaltseve in eastern Ukraine. He seemed like a good target because he was very active.
Okay, let's go back.
So this is the
too many windows. Okay, so Batu is a very common name in Central Asia. It refers to one of the grandsons of Genghis Khan.
Was said to have been sent to fight in Debaltseve in eastern Ukraine. He seemed like a good target because he was very active on Russian social.
Now I have to give you the history. What's going on here? Technically, Russia is not at war with Ukraine. It is trying to break away two eastern provinces in the basin of the Don River, otherwise known as the Donbass. Okay. So in other words, technically, Russian military, members of the Russian military didn't break away Crimea. They weren't there, nor were they in Donbass. How did Russia kind of project an image of plausible deniability? They had the members of its military take off any flags. And basically, from this point onwards, the Russians, members of the military, were known as the little green men of Crimea. With the case of Donbass, what are we having? They're not sending little green men to the east of Ukraine. They are sending what I call the colonial soldiers of the periphery. And look when I say that there's a neo-colonial dynamic going on. Let's watch the following. Okay, so let's go back to Batu.
Going into Ukraine and Russian troops going into Ukraine.
So there's not supposed to be Russian
We
troops in
decided
Ukraine.
to test the report's methodology by looking into the background of a fighter named Bato Dambayev, an ethnic Buryat from Siberia, whose unit on the Mongolian border was said to have been sent to fight in Debaltseve in eastern Ukraine. He seemed like a good target because he was very active on Russian social networks. So this is the profile page of Bato Dambayev on vk.com, which is a popular social network in Russia. And he's got photographs here going back to the year 2013, showing him in his home region, the Buryat Republic in Siberia. Here he's got an album called Army, picture of himself in his Russian army uniform. Here he is with some of his buddies at the base. And here he is taking yet another selfie with a Russian flag patch on his arm. This was posted on the 20th of January.
Which is important. That's what connects them to Russia.
In other words, just a few weeks before the crucial battle in Debaltseve. But where was it taken? The only way to know for sure was to try to find the spot myself.
I've come to Russia to retrace the trail of digital breadcrumbs that Dambayev left on his way to Ukraine from his home base in Siberia, thousands of miles away from the battlefield. And we're starting here in Moscow on the Red Square. Ну, чтобы Василий Блаженный Кремль попал, если можно.
Like so many other Russian soldiers, Dambayev has posted dozens of photographs of himself online. Some tell us more about his personality than his military service. But there are others that give away quite a bit about what the Russian army is up to. My first stop was 700 miles south, where we believed some of Dambayev's photos in uniform were taken.
So in other words, now this is his story. Now, if we go to this next part of the video, I want you to see how they were received in the war zone. And this is what I would argue kind of constitutes a form of, post-imperial neo-colonialism. So here's a town in the eastern part of Ukraine. Look what they say of the Russian soldiers who were in the area.
У вас тоже вытягивали из дома что-то?
Ну, лазили. Соседка была, пришли, ну, там была водка, меня в подвале бабушки готовила. Ни одной. Ну, то хер с ним, с той водкой. Дайте ей падают. Заходила соседка, ополченец там был, этот, ну, не русский, казах. Говорят, как казахи тут орудуют. Говорит, он узкоглазый.
Look at this language.
Казах что?
Remember, this is the former empire, Kazakhs, Buryat.
Вот это первые, которые зашли в ДНР, или потом, когда россияне зашли?
Нет, это уже были третья смена или какая. А там же не только россияне, тут и наши были. Вот первые зашли, то...
А россияне это те, которые с танками приехали.
Я не знаю, какие у нас вот напротив стояли россияне, все хорошие хлопцы. Я же говорю, у меня вот эти наши...
No, this is the local Ukrainian militia collaborating with the Russians.
А как себя россияне вели?
Да вообще молодцы, они нас кормили.
А как вы думаете, ДНР мог бы тут победить без их помощи, если бы они не приехали?
Это я не пих, мне кажется, нет.
Нет.
For me, what these women have just told us really corroborates the photographs and proves that there were Russian servicemen here, because they actually made a distinction between the Donetsk People's Republic fighters and the Russian soldiers, who they said were much better behaved.
Okay, and so there you go. Now, this is the irony, is because those local Ukrainian militias are stealing from the local Ukrainians that they're supposed to be protecting. Okay, so, but I showed it for this because you get an idea of kind of the domain, the dynamics of the former empire. Okay. What else did we, so from this point onwards, I'm going to finish up and shamelessly show articles I've written that if you want to learn more, okay, go ahead, feel free to read. Do you see when you use buryats, the little green men, you're paving the way to start to outsource the conflict to a private company in Russia that went by the code name Wagner. Okay. And if you are following the events of the summer, okay, the greatest challenge to Vladimir Putin's rule came as a result of using this mercenary group. Now, let's go through my next section. I'm talking about flows, right? So on one level, I talked about the flows of fighters from Siberia to the east of Ukraine. Okay. Now I want to talk about the next thing. Where did Wagner get its training? In Syria, in Africa, okay, working for nations such as the Central African Republic, not only projecting Russian military might there, but then also extracting something from the Central African Republic, diamonds, otherwise what we would call the blood diamonds. Okay, so see what I'm talking about, flows of good, right? Russian fighters flow all the way to Africa, diamonds flow in an economy that's trying to bust sanctions. So that when the 2022 phase of the conflict begins, what do you have? A battle-hardened military faction that gives the Russian government plausible deniability. A theorist named Karl von Clausewitz from the Napoleonic Wars had a famous saying, okay, war is politics by other means. Okay? For Russia, Wagner became an army by other means. And for Russia as well, the drones became an air force by other means. In this case, it would be Iranian drones. This is what they have in common. And this is what I talked about in this article. The US began this trend. You see, using contractors like Blackwater in Iraq made it easy for the US to project power in Iraq. And same with Russia. Because what is the easiest thing about using contractors? You don't have to report their deaths back to the public, you see. You see, it allows you to wage war without worrying about losing or having a high body count in the combat zone. That's what a drone does. A drone is basically saving a pilot from being shot down. And again, if any of you are following the news, even though Russia is using a lot of drones in Ukraine, it lost a lot of manned aircraft, almost 12 in 3 days. And that's a nightmare for Russia's image abroad, as well as domestically. This article I wrote with a Ukrainian student of mine. And here I describe what does Kyiv have in common with London during World War II. You see, the first cruise missile ever launched in human history was a weapon called the V1. It sounds like a chainsaw flying before it hits. And what is ironic is that's how Ukrainians describe the Iranian drone named as the Shahid, okay, the witness, okay. And I argue in this article that both the Shahid and the V1 have a lot in common. They're both cruise missiles. Now, read that if you want on your own. That's talking about the flow of Iranian drones. Okay. What's interesting about this dynamic is Turkey provides drones for Ukraine, Iran provides them for Russia. And what's ironic about this? For most of history, Iran and Turkey were buying weapons from the West. It was a rare inflection point in history now where Iran and Turkey become suppliers to two combatants in the West. And then now look at what I talk about this. The destruction of a dam in Ukraine. And I compare it to, now I wrote this in the summer of 2023, the water situation in Gaza. And I wrote this well before October 7th, 2023, because what I argued in both scenarios, whether it's Gaza, okay, or what happened in Ukraine, they are connected. Was I surprised by the events of October 7th, 2023? Okay. And this is what, now for my public health students, this is where our subject is coming in. When a population is thirsty and doesn't have access to clean water, not only do rare waterborne diseases reemerge, such as cholera, okay, people try to get access to fresh water. When I saw the events of October 7th, I saw that as a reaction of basically not having enough water to drink. In this case, why do I call this hydroterrorism and ecocide or hydronecropolitics? It's this: when the dam, the Hakova Dam, one of the largest dams, was deliberately destroyed in the summer of 2023, and the downstream area was basically flooded. It was a form of necropolitics because it killed not only humans, animals in a zoo, but then destroyed the soil for years to come. Why is that a form of necropolitics? And what do I mean by necropolitics? Is when you condemn a country to slow death. It's basically you made one part of Ukraine uninhabitable, just like the lands around Chernobyl. And don't forget that radioactive zone around Chernobyl. There was forest fires there during the COVID epidemic. So at that time in 2020, Ukraine was fighting in the east, dealing with radioactive fires in Chernobyl, as well as managing a pandemic. That's what I call necropolitics. Now, for public health, what is another thing going on in Ukraine? We're combining necropolitics with narcopolitics. A lot of drug cartels are flooding Ukraine, okay, with drugs. When a society is going through war, it's whether it's the US fighting in Vietnam or a society that's on the front line. What is fascinating, though, in this case is something that I came to a conclusion a long time ago, okay, is that there is one psychedelic known as ketamine that did wonders for American soldiers coming back from Iraq and Vietnam, Iraq and Afghanistan. And before this article came out, I had the theory that this is something that Ukrainian soldiers would need. How do I know that? Because you don't, I used to teach in Ukraine, but do you have Ukrainian soldiers here in San Diego? You'll see them. They their legs are amputated. They're mine victims. Okay. And when I talk to them, this is what I was thinking: the benefits it had for American veterans. Surely it could have the same benefits for their. Does anyone know what MDMA is? That's the active substance in which drug?
Ecstasy.
Ecstasy. Yeah, ecstasy. Okay. But for soldiers dealing with PTSD, now keep in mind, most Ukrainian males cannot leave their country. Okay. So basically, if you can't leave the country, you might have of course, most Ukrainian males, there's going to be an entire generation that's been mobilized to fight. Okay. Another article in the Economist. Okay. So in terms of history, this is a different history. This is in terms of the history of the kind of renaissance of the psychedelics. Okay. What was associated with the 60s counterculture might have its first laboratory in Ukraine, and the soldiers who, and when I argue, civilians also who suffer from PTSD. And then finally, just to talk about the flow of another aspect of this war, there is an entire generation of Ukrainian domestic pets that were orphaned as of 2022. Okay. Just to give you one graphic story, and it's kind of tragic, is usually when I tell this story to foreign audiences, that's when they really start to connect to the war in Ukraine. And it's just simply of a Ukrainian dog, okay, that went to drink water. Okay, and this was given to me by my co-author that I showed you in there. And basically what happened to this dog as he drank water, water came out of its neck. It had suffered shrapnel wounds, and that's it. It could never quench its thirst, okay, because of the shrapnel. Okay, every time it drank water, the water would just go outside of its neck. And it's kind of tragic that, and I call this a form of sentient security. In other words, it brings into kind of the aspect of what falls into the cracks in the greater history of conflict. And that one individual story of that one particular dog stuck with me. Now, as I conclude, the last thing I want to talk about is the flow of refugees. The people have been displaced. So if you see me here, okay, and this is a lost time. This is a golden age when I was able to take this picture. It's the year 2019, okay. So from 2016 to 2019, I used to have a summer school in Ukraine, in the city of Lviv. And the idea was to bring a group of international students there to teach them American history, Cold War history, and the likes. I want you to look at this group of students, okay? Because this is a piece of time that can never be created. Myself, a student from Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Afghanistan. Okay, so all the stans are there, and we're happy, and we're smiling. I would have never guessed what would happen to this Afghan student here and Yulia from Ukraine. Okay? How this is such a unique student. And now watch the following video. Watch the following. Take the Ukrainian student. This is what he showed outside of his living room in August 2021, when his hometown of Kabul fell to the Taliban. And keep in mind, I'm going to argue both of these videos are stories of the legacies of Russian imperialism. You can't understand the Taliban rising in Afghanistan without understanding the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1980. So let's watch. And sure enough, Abdul Ali will have to flee Kabul. I had to get him out, basically. So that's your living room. Now, you remember Yulia? This is her living room. In 2021 and 2022, the video is separated by 6 months. I would never guess that 2 of my students would have to endure this in their lifetime. And here comes the next story of flow, right? And again, I'm arguing these are flows as a result of the movement of peoples, but this is all the products of the dynamics of a post-empire. He made it to the US, she made it to Torino, Italy. This is February 24th, 2022. I was flying into Istanbul that day on the way to Lebanon. You notice when I landed in Istanbul, by this time, there was only one flight that was canceled. Rostov is very close to the war zone. And I was flying to Lebanon, okay, to go meet my aunt. This is my Aunt Maria. Okay. If you just want to know something about my background, I was raised as a Muslim. My side of the family is Muslim. She comes from the Lebanese Christian side of my family. So I come from a mixed faith Middle Eastern family. So when I was going to Lebanon, of course, this was the first day of the invasion, February 24th, 2022. Now, what am I? These are 2 Catholic priests from the village my grandma comes from. I want you to look at this bread here, the pita bread, okay? Because you have to understand, what was she realizing? What did that little woman realize as a result of the war in Ukraine? What was going to increase exponentially? So much that it would soon become out of her budget? You see, this pita bread cannot be made without Ukrainian wheat. It disrupted the entire global wheat market, you see, so that even in this living room in the mountains of Lebanon, I knew the war would affect her. Now, what's interesting, I'm telling you a story of refugees. If you look at her sofa, this is the UNHCR symbol. And I don't know how she was getting illegal blankets to make a sofa, but that's what my great aunt was doing. While I was in that living room, eating that pita. This was the news I was watching. Now, you see this woman, she is on the border with Poland. She has fled. She left her husband behind because her husband is going to have to fight. Now, why did this image so strike me in the living room of my Christian side of the Lebanese family? Is look at this iconic image of mother and child. And what was I looking at on the wall right above the TV? That image. Okay. Now, when I was preparing this lecture, it's just ironic. When I was trying to find icons of Mother Mary and baby Jesus, don't you think the resemblance is quite similar? I mean, I found it kind of shocking. This, baby that's bundled up, and this woman who looks so much like this other. At the end of the day, in the history, both of them were refugees at one time. So, my final article I'm going to push on you is what I was doing on February 24th, 2022. It's an article called From Ukraine to Lebanon, A Tale of Two Marias. She's Maria, and I tell the story of Maria Marchenko, my co-author, and her first day of the war. And let's not also forget, for those of you who are fasting, there are Ukrainian Muslims. They've been displaced twice in a lifetime. Remember when I was showing you a group of people called the Tatars in the old school map? The Crimean Peninsula was their traditional home. Okay? So imagine this is not only you're displaced from Crimea in 2014, then in 2022, you are displaced from Ukraine itself. The people I interview in this article were so shy. Okay, they're Crimean Tatars, they're Muslims, they were taken in by a German family. Okay. But before you start fasting, and this is the month of Ramadan for Muslims, the month of fasting, you have a morning breakfast before the sun rises to get you through the day. And they wouldn't even do that because they were scared of waking up their German hosts. They gave up their morning breakfast because they didn't want to abuse the hospitality of their hosts in Germany. And this is another story of flows. So I conclude with the following. With all of this, it's ironic, literally, as I'm speaking to you at 11 p.m. yesterday. Okay. At 11 p.m. yesterday, I was giving a lecture in Ukraine. The education I gave in Ukraine, that didn't stop. That's one of the benefits of Zoom. So you have to imagine 11 p.m. every night, I go online. It's 8 a.m. in Kyiv. But that's how early these kids will get it. I don't get paid, they don't get a degree. It's the idea you cannot let the war stop in education. I was giving a lecture on the Redskins. I'm teaching them American history, right? This is one student. I just helped talk to her for 20 minutes. And then what did she tell me? She got a PhD position just based on the advice I gave her for 20 minutes. So in all of this, and here I sent her the article I wrote about the destruction of the dam. I want you to see when I was getting that message, where was I? Oh, sorry, I already pulled up this video. Anyway, I was in a square in Rome when she sent me that message, where I teach a summer school. And listen what's playing in the background and where I am. For Anastasia, she got a victory. She got a PhD. To do what? Use digital resources. Think of that originally selfie video, to use digital resources to document war crimes committed in Ukraine. Look what I'm listening to. The operetta, so look at there. This is the square in Rome. That's the Ukrainian flag there. That's the Ukrainian flag right there in front of the French embassy. What is she thinking about? Vincero, I will win. I will survive. I will get through this. Okay. And I thought that was just kind of quite symbolic, whether it's the story of Anastasia or a nation going through war. Okay. It will survive. It will get through this. Okay. I'm very good. Sorry, that took much longer than I anticipated. I apologize for that.
What an engaging and extensive reflection of some of the trends that are taking place in this war, really Russia's attack on Ukraine. Uh, my my case study is much shorter. I wanted to zoom in on Central Asia and labor migrants that come from Central Asia and work in Russia today. I thought that Professor Al-Marashi did a fantastic job of connecting all the dots. So my case study should very much fit in into the framework that he provided. The mini maps that he showed were very helpful to appreciate the vastness of Russia in contrast to seemingly tiny Central Asia that is southwest of Russia. And what I really appreciated about what Professor Al-Marashi did is he really talked extensively about the border conflicts, the water that causing a lot of that. Well, that very much feeds into the story of Central Asia because what you see here on a map was created by the Soviet Union. Central Asia, as such, did not exist prior to Stalin's regime. So the way that the borders are drawn, you can even appreciate that on this map, are entangled. And today, because of conflict over water, Central Asia heavily depends on its former essentially mainland Russia. And that's one of the many ways that we see a heavy presence as well as again influence being
Next one.
yes
I'll take care of it for you.
being displayed. Another really important aspect of the way that Russia plays into both society, politics, primarily economy of Central Asia certainly has a lot to do with Central Asian migrants that live and work in Russia today. I wasn't able to find the exact number of how many Central Asian labor migrants are present in Russia today. But in 2021, there were over 2.6 million of them living and working. A more recent statistic is of Tajik nationals. 500,000 of them were registered in first quarter of 2023. That's approximately 95% of total Russian labor migrants overall. What I do find quite striking is the amount of money, right? These laborers send back home. That's really what keeps Tajik economy afloat and running. And it certainly also very much helps Russian economy. These labor migrants have to maintain their work permits. That adds to the Russian economy, but they also, are eager to do the kind of jobs that locals, Russians, that is, wouldn't do, and they do it for much cheaper. Thank you, Ibrahim. I thought it'd be critical for me to give a little bit of context as to what compels these people to move to Russia, to leave their homelands, and work in somewhat of a harsh terrain. They do face a lot of discrimination, particularly migrants from Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. It is definitely rooted in Soviet legacy that used to be essentially, mainland for the periphery. A big element of why Central Asians look towards Russia rather than Middle East has to do with Russian. Most Central Asians speak some Russian. And this is important because, as a native of Tajikistan, I can say that culturally, linguistically, religiously, we are more Middle Eastern, right? Tajikistan is Persian. We speak a dialect of Persian. It's predominantly Muslim, and culturally, obviously, we gravitate much more towards Middle East and Russia. But people that decide to make their journey to Russia already have family and some community based there because, again, of the Soviet past. Post-collapse of the Soviet Union, local economies in Central Asia, except for Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, have totally collapsed. The reason why we did not see that necessarily in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan has a lot to do with natural resources that the rest of Central Asia did not have. What replaced communism in terms of an economic system was crony capitalism, nepotism, and widespread corruption. People, the leadership that came post collapse of the Soviet Union to these countries never left. A good example of that, I thought, was the president of Tajikistan, Imam Ali Rahman, who came to the leadership position post civil war that erupted right when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1994. Interestingly enough, he never left. So if you think about it, his regime that is 30 years old is older than an average person who lives in Tajikistan. It's quite a young nation. So apply that to yourself. When most of you are 20 years old, I'm sure you've seen at least one or two presidents come and go, whereas in Tajikistan, growing up, I've only seen two, Nabiev and his replacement, Imam Ali Rahman, and he is currently grooming his son to replace him. That is very telling of story of Central Asia, in fact, quite applicable, except to Kazakhstan, where we did see some democratic movements, pretty much authoritarian regimes that are primary benefiters of natural resources. Therefore, high unemployment and local economies that can generally make it impossible for young people to provide for themselves and their families are compelled to move to Russia. Most of the remittances that make their way to Central Asia are spent on weddings. Marriages are universal, unlike here. Every Tajik, I think Kyrgyz and Kazakh young men and young women are expected to get married and have at least two to three children. Hence, again, preparations for these celebrations are quite extensive, and that's where remittances are mostly going. The same can be said about funerals. A lot of the people that move to Russia do so in order to help their families to move from rural areas to urban areas, rural areas, and primarily here, speaking of Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, are quite uninhabitable by now. There is no electricity and running water. So most of the money that they make, they send home to provide for their children, aging parents, but also to secure housing. Therefore, interestingly enough, many who make it to Russia tend to stay there. They gain citizenship and they're eager to build a new life, and some even have new families. But that is, again, a very telling story of what's happening in the former Muslim periphery, where there's basically no very little to kind of go back to post-collapse of the Soviet Union. Tajikistan did not have electricity for 15 years, and today that continues with that is actually connected to water, which I could speak extensively about. But I thought that Professor Al-Marashi did a fine job of it. Therefore, again, we are very much talking about migration that necessitated by both economy, political situation, and a social dynamic. So I thought that context would be really helpful for you to understand the four primary categories of that migrants that are being affected by war in Ukraine. First and foremost, the category that is heavily being enlisted in this war are those who are newly arriving to Russia. There are, as soon as you arrive to the airport, you are taken to specific centers where you are expected to essentially enlist to gain permits to work in Russia. These are, again, called specific essentially for migrant workers to obtain work permits. These specific centers now are being utilized, the same centers are being utilized to enlist these migrants in war efforts. And I'm going to provide specific examples in a second. The second category of Central Asian migrants that are being affected are actually students. The quality of education in Central Asia is quite poor. A lot of the students, like yourself, your peers, try to move to Russia to gain their education, especially in medical fields and engineering. Today, they're being threatened um, to lose their enrollment as well as their scholarships if they don't enlist in Russian army. The third category are those who are already citizens and have work permits to work in Russia. They're being told that if they don't enlist in war effort, they will either lose their Russian citizenship and will even force deportation. Again, I'm going to follow up with specific stories of that. The fourth category are the Tajik prisoners, about 10,000 of them, if not more, are currently imprisoned in Russia, and their story became quite popular or popularized and with public with Wagner Group that mobilized prisoners both of Uzbek, Kyrgyz, and other Central Asian backgrounds in a war. Many, many of their families, they had no idea that they were forcibly taken to Ukraine till their bodies started making it back to Central Asia. Thank you, Brahim. In 2022, Russian State Duma, equivalent of our Congress, passed a bill offering citizenship in exchange for one. In fact, that term has been even shortened in recent time for military service to make it attractive for migrants to serve in the war. As I told you about the specific centers where migrants, in fact, they directly go after they arrive to the country, the Ministry of Defense opened a recruitment center where migrants, in fact, have to report and enlist for work permits. In those same centers, now there are recruitment centers established by the Ministry of Defense to essentially make it, quick from buying your work permit to enlisting in the army. I thought these stories would not register without specific examples. There are numerous specific examples. This particular certainly subject is very intimate to me as a native of Tajikistan. I started hearing about my neighbors, my cousins, my uncles being enlisted in a war at the beginning of the war 2 years ago. And some of the stories that really caught my attention had to do when a family member was told by the administration of his university that if he does not enlist, he will lose his state scholarship. What is so incredible about the story is that his parents were lucky enough to pull him out of the country immediately. But many of your peers, same age as you, typically don't call home because they're embarrassed or they don't want to stress their parents out. So oftentimes what happens is that parents find out that their child was enlisted in war efforts with their dead body arriving to their home state. Mansour Hajib, who was 30 years old, a resident of the capital city, was deported from Russia in October, just weeks after he declined to sign a contract to join the Russian army. He was accused later, in fact, the day after the incident of possession of illegal drugs, which the state essentially used as justification for his deportation. Another person, Aziz, who refused to use his real name, again, there are a lot of repercussions, had dual citizenship. Dual citizenship is allowed, and many Tajik citizens today have Russian citizenship as well. That's where, I really, on Monday when we had another event in this class, I was talking about demographic changes, and similar to some of the demographic changes in our own country, Russia is also experiencing some of it. And what seems today so much of that is, again, connected to Professor Al-Marashi's discussion of Russian Empire and how that's being played out. And, it's really the former subjects that are being utilized as soldiers in this war as somewhat of like a symbol of prestige, but also colonial legacy, very much again in tune with the story of these Tajik people who are being pulled straight from the construction sites where they were working, taken into police station supposedly to check their IDs, and then finding themselves actually at a military enlistment offices. What's so sad about this entire story is that the Tajik embassy in Moscow is fully aware of what's happening. In fact, they have received numerous calls from family members whose sons are missing, and it's pretty clear when your son is missing, you know that they are either fighting in Ukraine or already are dead. Yet because of the connections, again, that Professor Al-Marashi talked about, this heavy presence of Russian influence in Central Asia, Tajikistan in particular. In fact, the current regime would not stand a chance without Russia in terms of existence. Tajik embassy simply cannot believe it. Some of the most compelling reports by institutes for peace and war have really been around this promise of Russian citizenship, migrants who are in dire situation, who have truly no way of returning because there's nothing really to go back to, are being promised citizenship if they enlist. Some of the stories that I do think made it to United States had a lot to do with Wagner Group and Prigozhin. It's the leader of Wagner Group who was recently assassinated. It's really was, you know, this whole idea of recruiting and mobilizing prisoners is attributed to him. Zulfikar Mukhydinov was serving a term for drug trafficking and was mobilized in Ukraine. But I really want to caveat this particular story is that yes, there are about 10,000, if not more, prisoners who are Tajik nationals in Russia today, but most of them are serving terms not for drug trafficking, but breaking labor laws. Oftentimes, these people arrive to Russia at the age of 15, 16, 17. They have no idea how to rightfully, legally gain work permits. And oftentimes, for that kind of violation, they end up in prison. And today, they also are enlisted straight from prison to fight in this war, which is truly heartbreaking because they have no support, right? They can't really go back to their government or their officials through the Tajik embassy, and certainly they cannot express their grievances through the Russian government. What I thought is also worthy of mentioning is that some of these migrants sign up to fight in this war voluntarily. They're being promised wages, in fact, regular wages. Some of the former soldiers who fought in this war that I was able to connect to told me that the promise of money, the financial outcomes were never delivered, but nonetheless, I thought it was very critical to mention the story of Kareem. He did not give his real last name. He was hired to dig trenches in eastern Ukraine. He said that he saw an online ad that offered $60 a day. And it was pretty clear from his interview that there were many others like himself that were promised money to essentially dig trenches, as kind of again captured here. And lastly, thank you. I want to mention it was this very interesting role reversal. Some of you might have heard that a lot of Russian people, Russian young men, ethnically Russian that is, are making their way back to Central Asia for the first time in 30 years. It's only interesting because, here Tajik, Kazakh, Kyrgyz soldiers being enlisted in the war when Russian ones are running away, and rightly so because they both disagree with this war, but at the same time they don't want to lose their lives. Russian men in their 20s and 30s dressed in shorts, carrying backpacks with lots of tattoos, appearing in urban areas of the capital city of Tajikistan. It's a very entertaining scene because it's a quite a conservative part of Central Asia where men don't typically wear shorts. Many find a lot of hope in these Russian men being in Tajikistan today. A lot of that hope is based on the fact that if they're treated well in Tajikistan, many believe that the discrimination and discriminatory attitudes that they essentially display to Tajiks will hopefully go away. And that truly is my hope too. And I thought, again, that there's so little reporting on the case study of Central Asia. I could not be more grateful how Professor Al-Marashi gave us this kind of a global picture of the empire and its utilization of former colonial subjects in the war. And now I hopefully gave you a perspective of specifically Central Asian Tajik soldiers being mobilized in the war effort, but also there's just kind of a very interesting trend of Russians going back to these peripheries, and that too providing a new glimpse into what can we expect. I mean, I'm certainly hoping to see some positive outcome in this darkness that this war has been. So we do have a little bit of time left, and I invite any questions you might have. We will finish exactly at 3:50. Thank you for your attention. Yes.
This question is for you, Dr. Atman. I was reading an article the other day about Africans being found in the Russian army, and I just wanted to know what other groups of people, other than Russians and Tajiks and some of the other groups of people you mentioned, what other groups are being found on the Russian side of the conflict?
Such a good question. A lot of ethnic groups, Nepalese and Indians were reported in recent news, which I find very interesting. And again, you see this references that they were tricked and that had no idea that they were actually enlisting in war efforts. For him to know other ethnic groups.
Well, it's so basically what we're seeing is the outsourcing of the monopoly of violence. So if we go back to Max Weber, Chechens, this is on both sides, and this is fascinating. So you have kind of the fighting. So since 1996, if you want to talk about on the periphery of the Russian Empire, it started to kind of Chechnya was the first place where you had an uprising. And then finally, the only way Russia could conquer Chechnya was when a good number of Chechens just started to work and co-opt themselves with the Russians. So you had the pro-Russian Chechens fighting viciously on behalf of Russia. But then you have the opposition Chechens fighting with the Ukrainians against Russia as well. That I found quite interesting. And let's not forget Americans. America and literally at the House of Ukraine, they had organized an event where there was this. His name is Sergio. He fought in the Marines, and then when he basically felt that what happened in Ukraine was a fight for freedom around the world, he went to fight in Ukraine. He lost his eye. Okay, and this is the thing. Now, when he's back here, medical insurance won't cover, because he lost his eye in Ukraine. So the only way he could survive is getting donations from his Instagram account. So I mean, it is really globalized in that respect.
This is such other questions, please. Yes, that's it.
I have a question for Professor Al-Marashi.
Sure.
If I can get in time. As recent as February 2023, there's humanitarian groups like Cartoon Endowment for International Peace that have been mentioning troubling conversations that regarding the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, that it's ultimately serving as a testing ground for military AI technology.
Good question.
For nations like Iran, Turkey, Qatar, and others. And this is in regards to fully autonomous killer drones, as they refer to them to. Do you believe that the current trend towards military armed supremacy is eroding any humanitarian and ethical concern for the plight of innocent citizens, regardless if they're Russian, Ukrainian, or including those who are from Tajikistan and Uzbekistan from Central Asia?
Such a great question.
That's a great question. I'm shamelessly gonna highlight another. Between Daggers and Alexanders is an article I wrote. I'll tell you, basically, when I went to Ukraine for the first time, I had an argument. Every Russian missile and plane that was tested over the skies of Syria, I argued would be a rehearsal to use them in Ukraine. Okay. Russia was an arms expo. It was an open yeah, this is what I call it. Between daggers and Alexanders, referring to the Russian arms expo in Ukraine. In other words, Syria was an attempt for Russia to test its Caliber cruise missile. And sure enough, on the first morning of February 24th, what rocked Ukraine were those calibers that were tested over the skies of Syria were now fired towards Ukraine. Absolutely, it is an arms expo for Russia. Let's not forget the US has also had great advertisement with something called the HIMARS system. It's a multiple artillery launch system. Iran requests for Iranian Shahids has skyrocketed. The UAE signed a multi-billion-dollar deal with Turkey for the Bayraktar. Now, if you're talking about killer robots, actually the first killer robot was supposed to have been, the question was a Russian drone given autonomy to pick targets? It turned out to be a rumor. Probably the first time this happened was when Turkey used a drone in Libya. And that drone in Libya was actually targeting members of the Wagner group fighting for a renegade Libyan general. Okay. So you see what happened in Ukraine. I mean, the Turkish drones got training in Libya and Syria. Wagner got training in Libya and Syria. And I was arguing it's only a matter of time before this is all going to come back to Ukraine. And sure enough, I hated that prediction, which came true. I'm trying to find a picture. I cannot. But I want to just tell you an interesting anecdote. When I hear of Tajikistan, I want to tell you this. The first time I ever went to Iraq as an adult was in 2004. And I had to go. I was basically the cultural liaison for an American senator. I was his basically Iraqi poster boy. Now, the American soldiers who were guarding us, you have to imagine there's a row with a mile of trucks. Sorry, I can't get it here, right? The soldiers who were guarding us barely spoke English. And I asked them where they're from. And they said El Paso, Texas. Okay. I want you to think of where these soldiers are from. If they're from El Paso, Texas, where are they from? They're right on the border with Texas and Mexico. What do you think they're being guaranteed by deploying to Iraq? American citizenship. But this is the crazy thing was this. What were they doing in Iraq when I talked to them? They were creating another border. You see, what were these soldiers guarding? A checkpoint in an area called the Green Zone of Baghdad. The Green Zone was basically a no-go zone for any Iraqi. Any Iraqi that approached the Green Zone, this is in their own capital, would be shot on sight. Okay. So do you see the irony for these two young men from El Paso, for them to cross one border, they had to enforce another in Iraq. And that's when I hear the story of these Tajiks, I think of these two young men from El Paso who were, and I told this story on the 20-year anniversary of the Iraq War in San Diego State here. And basically everyone in the audience, I didn't even have to say anything when I showed that picture and I told them in the background, they all said, these are guys who joined to get their citizenship. I didn't even have to articulate that. So this is, I mean, this is really a global story.
Such a good analogy. Other questions?
Yes.
How do you think, like, offering citizenship for enlisting versus threatening to remove citizenship for enlisting or tricking people into enlisting, like, that affects the success of an army because one seems much more demoralizing than the other?
Yeah, one is a form of slave labor, basically. It's a gang press. One is absolutely voluntary, and the other is essentially, and then it's unfortunate it's been a tactic used throughout human history. So there is that fine distinction. But there's also something we also have to acknowledge that does occur in the US. When she mentioned the ages, basically, so the first time, before I became a professor, the first job I had was working for an organization, an NGO that tried to ban child soldiers. the use of child soldiers. What are the two countries, the greatest violators of the use of child soldiers? What are those countries? The country that uses the most child soldiers. The UN defines a child soldier anyone under the age of 18 in an army. Yes?
Is it the Congo?
No. Sure, there's plenty, and they're used by non-state actors, but that's not the largest.
Afghanistan?
No. There's sure plenty of child soldiers in the Taliban.
Ayman?
Yeah, South Tennessee, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan.
And your guess?
Yemen?
Yemen, where I used to live, the best year of my life. Every kid has a gun. I think the whole nation is that of child soldiers. You're absolutely right. It's the US. You can join the US Army at age 16. That, by definition, is a child soldier by the UN standards. After that is the UK. You could join when you're at age 17. That and again, I'm just trying to get you to think of how these are stories that are global in nature.
You
Yeah.
cannot drink before the age of 21, but you can certainly sign up to fight.
Right. And yeah, that was a shock to me when I joined this organization. They said, so technically those are the two countries we can't touch. But then all the other countries you mentioned, those are the countries I worked on.
We have time for one more question, if anyone has last. Yes, Gavin.
So this is kind of a build-up of the other question, but there's been a lot of talk of flow of weapons from Iran and Turkey to these conflicts. But there's been a large flow of U.S. weapons to the conflict as well. Has there been any instances of, maybe U.S. technology, kind of more advanced U.S. technology being used? I know there's been the deployment of like long-range artillery systems supplied by the U.S.
Well, the first F-16s are supposed to arrive. It's going to take it takes a long time to integrate those into an Air Force. But I think by the time they got there, it's too late.
I want to say, in the recent reporting that I've read, a lot of the weaponry that we sent to Ukraine was old weaponry, right?
Old Soviet weaponry.
Also, old Soviet, but also old that we had, us giving it to Ukraine and calling it aid. Oftentimes, it's a bit misleading, but that's what it is. That allows us to build new technology and to employ new people and feed our economy. So it's a very interesting global, again, development that these wars will be that in the Middle East and Ukraine that very much intimately affect us and our economy through obviously our involvement. Yeah.
I think Starlink, after a while, Elon Musk said, I'm not going to give this away for free. Now I want to get paid for it as well. So, I mean, it goes from anything from Starlink. Viasat in Carlsbad is also offering satellite coverage for Ukraine as well. So, I mean, this is also a very local issue.
I would like to thank you all for being here. I know that we didn't have seats for everyone. Greatly appreciate your interest, and I think that's what's so inspiring about being in our campus. You wanting to stay informed. Those of you in my class, please again remember that it will come in handy in the upcoming assignments. Other than that, have a great rest of your day. I have to run, but Professor Al-Marashi might stay here for a second if you have some additional questions.
If you have any
Go ahead.
questions,
Sorry, I
yeah.
have to run this
No,
trial.
of course. Oh, yeah, of course. No, this was, thank you for arranging this. I'm so grateful.
It's so wonderful. Thank you so much.
No, my
Really
pleasure.